So here's an example of a test I did on my machine with this yarn, and I started with the loosest going up to the tightest tension. And so this is kind of like an example of what you can do when you first get your machine to practice with different tensions, or if you get a new yarn and want to see what tension's going to work well with it and what's not going to work. So I'm going to show you kind of my process of how I do it, and then hopefully this will kind of help you when you are working on your projects or getting new yarn. I have yarned on this number 4 medium weight yarn, and this one's kind of an in-between medium 4 between this one's a bit thinner, and this one's pretty bulky. Okay, so I did 10 rows with it in this middle hole, and I'm kind of holding on to it here, gauging my tension. One thing that helps with tension, and one thing that I found out, I thought sometimes it needed looser tension when I was having issues with my yarn. Come to find out, like when I was using this really bulky yarn, I had it on this outer tension. I wasn't even holding it, and I thought it needed less tension. It kept tucking the stitches. It actually needed more tension. I think I was in the middle one holding it. So this one needed more tension. So if you haven't worked with a yarn, make a hat and see what's going on. Make your sample project. You know, it's kind of like your gauge. If you ever hand knit or crochet, they say to do your gauge. Do that if you haven't worked with the yarn. Another thing that I have found out, instead of having it on your counter, put it in a bowl on the ground underneath you. That extra little bit of weight that it has coming off, that helps with your tension. But I still keep my hand here because, again, as that skein, you get less and less the skein, you get less and less tension. So I always keep my hand here because as my skein gets less and less, I might add a little bit of tension with my finger. So if you crochet or you knit, you know tension's very key to making a project. Same kind of thing goes with this, and you'll kind of get used to it after you make your projects. So let's look at tension. This is your tension bar. Now, some people talk about it that it flies off, and it can. If it gets stuck, it will fly off of it. So you want to make sure there's no knots in your skein. So if you want to wind it in a ball, that sometimes helps too. But I find if I wind the ball, or if you have one of those cake makers, I do have a little bit of less issues. It just takes a little bit of front prep that I'm not always patient about. If your yarn skein is over this way, when it gets that tight tension pulling it, yeah, it's gonna fly right out. So that's why I always have, or say it's here in this one and you have your yarn skein over to this side of it, if it gets that tension, yeah, it's gonna pull it out, right? So I like having my yarn directly in front, no matter where I have it on the tensioner. Directly in front on the ground also seems to help it from flying out of this. So let's look at what it looks like if I do the outermost tension. Now I do have it on the ground, okay? And I'm not gonna really hold it. Already, as I'm coming around, we're having issues. See how that's hooked? It shouldn't be hooked like that. It needs to be underneath. So if you're not watching for that, you're gonna start to have issues. Even if you don't have any issues, it's just going to be a looser pattern, which if that's what you're going for, that's fine. I'm going to do about 10 rows. Now, besides the fact we had some issues in the beginning, it did okay, but look at how much more open this is. And this is the purl side we're looking at. Look how much more open that is compared to this. Now this isn't wrong, it just depends on what you're wanting to go for. But if you're finding it really open and it's dropping stitches or tucking stitches, it's probably too loose on the machine. Something's not right and it needs to be tighter. So now let's just move it to the middle. And I'll do 10 rows. Now, I'm not even gonna hold it with my hand. Ooh. But see how I wasn't holding it with my hand? Look at that knot. So it hit that and it kind of flew off the machine. So those are annoying. So that's why I like to hold it with my hand as well. So here's where you sometimes can have that issue come into play too. We're going to cut out that knot. We're going to make sure it's all the way down in that tensioner. We're going to make sure it lines up in the same needle right there so we don't skip a stitch. Here's where we have to be a little bit more careful. When we add in that yarn, hold it. I'm trying to keep the same stitch and tension as I had. Hold it one more time. Now we can just do a loose knot to keep it from falling out. And then you want to secure that at the end of your project. Okay, let's do a few more. Okay, so here was the loosest. Here was when we did it without me holding it at all. Now let's do the last one. This is tight. I won't really hold it with my hand. Okay, so here we have loosest, second loosest. Now we're at tightest. Okay. Now it also says when you look in your book that if you put it in the first hole, weave it over into the second hole and then into this one. This is called like the tightest you can do. This yarn might be too big for that. I usually use this for when it's the number 3 weighted. And that's what this guy is. This is a number 3, this is a number 4. They're kind of similar in weight. This is a thinner number 4, but I definitely keep this more for my number 3s. But let's just see, right? We're just seeing what we want for our pattern and what's gonna work with the machine. Ooh, see how it's doing that? That's not good. That probably means it's too tight. Let's just make sure it's not getting bogged down there. Get some fabric yarn loose and see it's coming out. It's not liking it, but I have one yarn that it does this and it works really good. So even if it just doesn't want to stay in there, that could be okay. Yeah, see, it doesn't want to stay in there, but it likes it there. And depending on how tight we want our knit to look, let's see what it does and see if we have any issues in the machine. If your machine jams to where it does not move, do not force it so you do not break your needle. Just remove it from the machine. This might be too tight. It's really bouncing my camera. Okay, so now we have our really tight. So now let's take it off the machine. I'm going to do just like how I did at the beginning. In the beginning, I had it here and I was doing tension with my hand, not just in here, which is kind of, I think, an in-between of between this one and this one without it. And you don't want it up like this. That's when you know there's like stress on your machine. You kind of want it just like barely bouncing, and that's kind of how like you can help control that with your hand. You can kind of feel it after a while once you did this. I've been doing this machine for a few years, so you kind of will learn that. You'll learn the feel. Okay, so we're just going to take it off the machine. Now, the one thing I have to say is this yarn, it did very well in all the tension. I'm using this one, this Crown Simply Soft. I feel like the softer your yarn is, the easier it does work. This one, it liked it. There's some yarns where you can't go through all these tensions. It will just stop working. So overall, this worked really well on the machine. I definitely would not do the very tightest where it goes through all 3 holes. This one was still a little bit too thick, even though it did work. I had to go pretty slow and it bogged down the machine a lot. So I just don't want to stress the machine out. But either the tight or the middle one worked really well. So I'll just undo this one, roll it in a ball, and start my project. So hope this helps, and happy crafting.